Hello, early modern philosophy students. Today I will be talking about the second part of the main transcendental question from Kant's Prolegomena. The second part deals with how natural scientific knowledge is possible. As you will recall, the first main part of the transcendental question has to do with what makes knowledge in math and geometry possible, and this leads Kant to tell us some interesting things about space and time as being a priori forms of intuition, and also leads into some of his initial discussions of the phenomenal and noumenal worlds, and that's going to be a distinction that's very important for his entire metaphysical system, and we'll see that more next time. On Wednesday, I'm going to want you guys to read the third part of the main transcendental question. How is metaphysical knowledge possible? And again, we'll see the important role of that phenomena-noumena distinction, as Kant will use that distinction to help try and resolve some age-old philosophical disputes, such as whether the world has a beginning in time, or whether we have free will, and whether free will is consistent with determinism. Things like this. We'll get into that next time. Today, of course, I'm going to start out by looking at some of the student responses. Again, I've received some very good student responses, interesting questions, interesting problems raised for Kant's claims that occur in that section, part one of the main transcendental question, where Kant talks about space and time and geometry and mathematics. Before I get into responding to those questions, by now, each one of you should have gotten, everybody except one student. I had one paper came in a little bit late, which I haven't graded, but everybody else should have gotten in your email a version of your paper that has my comments, you know, on the paper. Everybody should have gotten a grade on the term paper. Again, you guys do have the opportunity to make revision to those term papers. If I remember correctly in my email, I think I said that those papers are due a week from today. So, keep that in mind, and certainly feel free to be in touch with me, to talk with me about your paper, maybe show me a draft version of a revised paper as you work on trying to improve upon your papers. If you like the A or the A minus or the B plus or the B that you got on the paper, you don't have to make revision to the paper. But I suspected a number of people with B papers, C papers, D papers, will want to try and improve their papers and get a better score on it. Keep in mind also that there will be some kind of take-home final exam that will be given, and that will take place next week, and you'll have several days to do that take-home exam. I sent an email about all of this, but regardless, let's turn to student comments. Right, recall that Immanuel Kant, he has this view that math and geometry yield synthetic a priori knowledge that is not that is not just definitional knowledge. Rather, in math and geometry, we know things without empirical evidence. We can know things, and yet it is not analytic. So in math and geometry, we formulate true propositions that we know, where the content and the predicate's not contained in the content of the subject term of the proposition. And so this would be synthetic knowledge, yet we can know these things without empirical evidence. And so this would seem to suggest that math and geometry, if they're not just definitional, if they're synthetic, then they must be about something that goes beyond the definition of terms. And Kant says what they are about is they are about space and time. But Kant thinks if this stuff is a priori and doesn't depend on empirical evidence, then the truths of math and science, which are about space and time, this would then suggest that space and time cannot be external to the mind, but must be something internal to it. And so Kant ends up coming with this idea that space and time just structure our perceptions of the world. We see the world in space and we see events occur in time. But space and time, they're just internal to our mind, structuring our perceptions and experiences of reality. And space and time, for Kant, they articulate the rules by which spatial and temporal experience must be ordered. The necessary rules by which they must be ordered. Now, I've got here something from Autumn Klein, and I'll try responding to it. I felt, I've been getting a lot of challenging, interesting questions and comments ever since we went online. Here's what Autumn, and here's something Autumn Klein writes. I'll do my best to give a Kantian response here. Autumn Klein says that she writes, although it is true that we can only see evidence of time having taken place and things being within space, I believe that they are not confined to existing only in our consciousness. So Autumn is suggesting that space and time don't only exist in consciousness. She says, if someone wakes up from a 20-year coma, oftentimes they will not know how much time, if any, has passed. If time is dependent on consciousness, without it, one would have no sense of time, even though we obviously know time would still exist and continue on despite that person being in a coma. The same can be said for space, as our surroundings do not drastically change while someone would be in a coma and without consciousness either. You would not be in a hospital one minute and in the ocean in another. There is consistency in the existence of space external to us despite us not being conscious of it. So, in responding, I probably could have said things about space here. I focused on the elements of time. In particular, I focused on this point that Autumn makes, that if somebody wakes up from a 20-year coma, oftentimes they will not know how much time, if any, has passed. And she says, if time is dependent on consciousness, without it, one would have no sense of time, even though we obviously know time would still exist and continue on despite that person being in a coma. Look, in reply to this, Autumn, I said that I think Kant would agree that if one is in a coma and has no conscious experience to which she can measure time, right? If she has no conscious experience, she cannot apply the a priori form of intuition, right? If they're in a coma and they're not having experiences, then they can't apply the a priori form of intuition. That is time. Right? And so if one is in a coma, then one will not be able to know how much time has passed while one is in coma. Right? Thus, somebody who's been in coma will come to consciousness and will have to ask others, how long have I been unconscious? But I am not sure this is a problem for Kant, because other people will have had the conscious experience of events occurring in time, right? And so they will have experienced the passage of time, right? Other people will have experienced the passage of time, right? While this person is in a coma. And that's because they will have measured time through the consciousness of experience of events occurring in time, right? So I think Kant will say, yes, of course, that person's going to come to and wonder how much time has lapsed, right? But Kant is committed to the view that the time has lapsed because there are other beings in existence, her friends and family, right, the doctors and nurses, who have been experiencing events, right? And so they can measure the lapse of time through their experience of events, right? I think Kant will say, look, if nobody existed, to have any experience of events, then there would be no time passage. But that is just a consequence of his view, right? Without conscious perceiving minds, there will be no time, right? Without minds, there's no time for Kant. Just like with Berkeley, without minds, there is nothing, right? Right? Berkeley's got a view. The only things that exist are minds and their ideas. And without minds, for Berkeley, there wouldn't be anything, right? So too with Kant. Without conscious perceiving subject with a priori form of intuition of time, there wouldn't be any time. And I could say similar things about space. So that's just the view. But time can pass when one is in a coma. It's just the person in the coma is unaware of the passage of time, but time passes because there are other conscious perceiving beings that are experiencing events which occur in time, right? And those people will be able to tell you how much time has passed when you come to. So that's what I want to say about that in response to Autumn Klein. Let's look at something else. I've got something here by Laura Naide. And, Naide, I'm not sure how well I understand your comments, but there are some things that I find interesting going on here. Naide writes, and I will focus on just a bit of what she writes. She says, Naide writes, I am confused as to why Kant believes that time cannot be empirically proven. All of the structures of time that we have are based on empirical facts. We created hours to match up with how long it takes for the Earth to turn 360 degrees on its axis. We created 1 year to match up with how long it takes for the Earth to travel completely around the sun, etc. Those are empirical facts on which time is based. And she goes on, she says, so while I do understand and somewhat agree with Kant, with what Kant says about time and space, and that they structure our experiences in our head, I do not agree that time is not empirically proven. A few things I want to say about this. And actually, as I reread this, Laura, I noticed some other things in what you said here. So some of my comments may not fit entirely. Laura, I want to say this. Look, we say there are 24 hours in a day, but we could have a different unit by which we measure time. Suppose that we didn't have the concept of hours and minutes. Instead of hours, we had boons, and instead of minutes, we had blinks. And imagine that the length of those did not equal in time to hours and minutes, just as liters, right, metric liters don't equal gallons. In this case, days wouldn't be understood in terms of hours. Maybe we'd say that days are 30 boons long, and this makes the measure of time seem more relative to the observer. And maybe my point there was maybe more mind dependent. But maybe my comments here are not on point to what you're driving at, Laura. Maybe what you want to say is that regardless of how we measure time, whether in boons or hours or minutes or blinks, we still need empirical evidence to know how long a day lasts or to know that nightfall occurs after sunrise. But I think Kant will agree that this requires empirical evidence to know how long a day is or to know that nightfall occurs after daytime. But for Kant, the point is that those experiences occur internal to our consciousness, right? The experience of day, the experience of night, they occur internal to consciousness, and those experiences are ordered in necessary ways in accordance with the rules of space and time. We all experience nightfall after sunrise because that is how time orders experience for us. It is not because that's the way things are external to our minds, right? External to our experience. How things are external to our experience is unknowable. And we don't experience time, we experience events which occur in time. But if the events existed external to our minds, we couldn't know them. And since the events are internal to our minds as experienced, then time must be internal to our minds, right? Shaping that experience. So that's what I want to say to it. So let's take a look at another point raised here. This is Caleb Rigdon. Rigdon moves away, to some extent he moves away from the issues of space and time. Rigdon seems fascinated, or relatively fascinated, by the phenomenal noumenal distinction that's initially introduced here in the first part, right, of the main transcendental question on space and time and mathematics. Caleb Rigdon writes, "My question is, why does Kant think noumenal objects exist? To me, it does not seem like he is giving any real grounds for the existence of such objects. He really doesn't give a good reason why we can know they exist outside of our minds, other than as a way to keep his name out of the same sentence of other idealists." Right? So Rigdon seems to be suggesting Kant only suggests that there are noumenal objects, things in themselves, just so he can separate himself from Berkeley. Rigdon goes on and says, is knowledge of noumenal objects synthetic a posteriori? It would almost have to be, because how can you just know something exists as noumenal a priori without having experienced it, separate from the phenomenal objects in our mind? In other words, I think Kant just made this distinction up, and it happened to fit with what he was thinking. I've sometimes wondered about these things myself, Caleb. I'm going to try my hand at explaining why Kant says what he says that maybe makes him look a little bit better. But, I've often puzzled over this myself. In particular, I puzzled, does Kant really give us a good reason to think that there are things in themselves external to consciousness? Look, I think Kant is led to posit the existence of noumenal objects, things in themselves external to consciousness. I think he's led to posit the existence of noumenal objects because there is a passive receptivity to perception. Right? We don't just conjure up what we perceive. Rather, oftentimes we cannot avoid having many of the perceptions we have, and they come to us against our will. I look to my right, and I see, Robert Vanderschaft, Luke Vanderschaft. Maybe I don't want to see him, but I can't help seeing him. Or maybe I really don't want to see my computer now. As I can turn my gaze this direction, I can't help but seeing the computer. I'm not conjuring up my experiences of Luke Vanderschaft or the computer. They come to me, seems against my will, right? And there's sort of a passive receptivity to the experience of the computer, right? We don't just conjure up what we perceive. Rather, we cannot avoid having many of the perceptions we have, and they come to us against our will. But there must be a cause to our perceptions, and they don't seem to be a product of our minds. So Kant thinks there's an external causal source, the thing in itself, the computer in itself that stimulates my experience of the computer, right? Luke Vanderschaft in himself that causes my Vanderschaft experience. Thinking about Berkeley, God plays the role of the stimulus for Berkeley, and material objects play the role of the stimulus of our experience in Locke and Descartes. Right? Furthermore, I'm going to say that I think Kant's going to say that the knowledge of noumenal objects is not synthetic a posteriori, because we have no experience of noumenal objects. Right? Noumenal objects, they are the causal stimulus of our experience, but they are not things that we experience. They're just the basis, the causal stimulus for the experience, right? We don't experience the noumena, they cause the experience. So we come to know of noumenal objects through reflection on what makes experience possible, but we don't experience the noumenal. So it seems to me it's a kind of a priori knowledge, our knowledge of the noumena, right? And we come to this knowledge a priori by reflecting on what makes our experience possible, right? But we don't experience the noumena itself, right? Whereas, like, my knowledge that water drowns those who can't swim, my knowledge that the earth revolves around the sun, right? Those require empirical observation, right? Those, right? And those are not analytic. Those are synthetic a posteriori truths. My knowledge that sharks have many rows of sharp teeth, right? I have to empirically observe sharks to know this, etc. I have to engage in certain celestial observations to know that the earth revolves around the sun, etc. Right? All of that is synthetic a posteriori, right? Because they're based on experience. But I don't experience the pneuma. They're just the causal basis of what I experience. And then I have to engage in some sort of reasoning, a priori reasoning, to get to the knowledge of their existence. One last thing, I'm going on maybe too long about all of this. This is actually a question, it's an interesting question. Maybe I will ask around, maybe I will do some further research. But Daniel Kim, at the very end of his writing, he gives a very nice sort of account of what goes on in the first part of the main transcendental question. Now, I will tell you guys now, I don't have an answer for Daniel Kim. Daniel Kim asked, I only have one question for Kant, and that is how Kant would feel about some of the new modern ideas of time. Physics is on Daniel Kim's mind. With ideas such as time being relative to everyone and time being affected by one's spatial location. Like if you live higher above sea level, you should age faster. It seems that time is some kind of external force that can be studied and is not just exclusively in our minds. How would Kant respond to this? I'm also interested in things that might happen, conceivably might happen through space travel, approaching and moving into or moving near black holes as such. There's a film that I think is grounded to some extent. I may be wrong about this, but I'm under the impression that this movie, which is quite interesting, Interstellar, is grounded in some understandings of the nature of space and time and how it operates in and around black holes. And that movie deals with aging and time processes. I don't have an answer to you, Daniel. It's quite interesting. Hey, let's move on. Let's take a look at new stuff, things that you should have read about for today. Hopefully you've got your outlines handy. Let's talk some more about the prolegomena to any future metaphysics. I don't know how much I'll have to add to my outline here. You guys, I think you had a pretty sizable chunk of reading for this. I'm going to focus a good bit on the notion of causation. One reason I want to do this is because we looked at Immanuel Kant's work on causation, and Kant harkens back to David Hume's work on causation, and we've studied Hume. And causation seems also so important to the nature of science. Science seems very largely devoted to giving causal accounts of why we experience the world as we experience it. Let me start with some general remarks. In other words, to some extent what I'm saying, there's a lot going on here. We've only got so much time. I'm going to focus in on the causation dimensions of the reading. And Kant also gives some nice examples to illustrate his points, and I will work with some of Kant's own examples here. According to Kant, what makes scientific knowledge possible is the fact that there are innate concepts of the human understanding that we employ in constructing judgments of experience. Most importantly, we have an innate concept of cause, or an innate concept of necessary connection, that we employ in making the causal claims that are fundamental to scientific practice. As I said a moment ago, giving causal explanations for why certain events occur as opposed to other events, given certain antecedent conditions. Giving causal explanations is so important and fundamental to the scientific enterprise. And Kant thinks that what makes the scientific enterprise and what makes science possible in large measure has to do with the fact that we've got an innate concept of cause that can be applied to our perceptions, letting us make causal judgments of experience. Now, the question can be raised, why does Kant think the concept of cause is innate? I think, first of all, and I'm working with, if you have your outline or your outline up on your computer, you can follow along here. First of all, I think, Kant believes that Hume is partially correct. Right? Again, I'm dealing with the question, why does Kant think the concept of cause is innate? First of all, Kant thinks Hume is partially correct. I think Kant's view is that we cannot derive the concept of cause or necessary connection just from the data of perception. For example, repeatedly perceiving A, the sun shining on a stone, and B, the stone growing warm, you cannot derive the causal judgment. It is the sun that warms the stone. Repeated perceptual data that are conjoined in our experience do not establish a necessary or causal connection. They only establish a constant conjunction in our experience. And this example of the sun shining and the stone being warm, it's right there. This example is used by Immanuel Kant himself, right? And I think Kant's point is that even though day after day I see sun shining on stone, I feel the stone warm, I make those two perceptions. I have those two perceptions repeatedly day after day. I see sun shining on stone, oh, stone is warm, right? Just from those perceptions by themselves, I cannot infer a necessary connection between sun shining and stone growing warm. I cannot infer that necessary connection because the perception is just a perception of a constant conjunction between sun shining and stone being warm. The perception is just a perception of the constant conjunction of those. It's not a perception of a necessary causal connection. And in this sense, Kant thinks Hume is right. But point two, Kant says we do nonetheless make causal judgments of necessary connections. For instance, we do make the judgment that it is the sun that causes the warming of the stone. And we do this without ever perceiving a necessary connection. All that we perceive is the constant conjunction between sun shining and stone growing warm. All we perceive is the constant conjunction. But nonetheless, we do make the judgment that the sun causes the warming of the stone. So we make that judgment of experience that it is the sun causing the warming of the stone. So we obviously have the concept of necessary connection. We obviously have the concept of causation because we make these causal judgments in living our lives. But perception doesn't give us the experience of necessary connections. Perception only gives us the experience of constant conjunctions. And right now, a third point here is, look, the concept of cause, it's either innate within our minds or it's derived from perception. And Kant has already said that Hume is right. We don't derive the concept of cause from perception. Therefore, conclusion, the concept of cause must be innate to our minds, right? What's going on here is Kant wants to say, in perception, we experience constant conjunctions of certain sorts of events, right? To go back to my student's favorite example, pin released in air, pin falling, pin released in air, pin falling. Well, right, or kicked in the shin, ouch, pain, kicked in the shin, ouch, pain, right? In perception, we experience constant conjunctions of events, right? And that's all that we experience is constant conjunctions of events. Nonetheless, we say that one event is necessarily connected to the other, leading us to make the causal assertions, right? So that means since the concept of since we don't experience necessary connections, but we've got the concept of it, Kant wants to say that notion of necessary connection of cause is inherent to our minds, ordering the way we formulate our judgments of experience. Now I want to talk about the innate concept of cause and verifiable claims in science. When we employ the innate concept of cause to perceptual data to form judgments of experience, we make claims that articulate laws or rules for how human experience must proceed. And this is the hallmark of science. Science wants to give us natural laws that explain how the objects of our experience and how events within our experience must occur. Right? Right? And science has a verifiability and an objectivity to it, which is established by our having these a priori concepts of the understanding that we can use to formulate judgments of experience, right? Which make universal claims about how we must all experience events passing in time. For example, when I say the sun warms the stone, when I say the sun causes the warming of the stone, what this means is that, right, there is a necessary connection between the sun shining on the stone and its growing warm. And when I say this, I mean that anyone else who experiences the sun shining on the stone will also experience the warming of the stone. The latter claim here is a universal claim that is open to empirical testing. And again, this is a hallmark of science. Thus, it is by having innate concepts of the understanding like that of cause or necessary connection that we are able to make these empirically testable objective judgments of experience. You know, by way of another example, again, it's probably killing you guys, right? Right after perceiving in constant conjunction many times the releasing of objects into the air and their falling, releasing of object into the air and its falling on planet Earth, right? I'm then led to say that releasing objects into the air on planet Earth causes them to fall, right? But when I say that, I'm saying there's a necessary connection between the releasing of objects into the air and my then experiencing them fall to the ground, right? And that causal, right, application of the concept of cause to my perceptions leads me to form the judgment that the releasing on planet Earth, the releasing of objects into the air causes them to fall. But this is right. This is a universal claim, and I'm saying that as a matter of law, of natural law, when things are thrown into the air on Earth, they will come to the ground, assuming we're not throwing a helium-filled balloon, right? And the idea here is, and when I say that sort of thing, what I'm suggesting is that anyone who experiences an object tossed into the air will then experience it falling, right? The gravitational laws explain why it is that we must experience objects on Earth that are tossed falling to the earth, right? But all of that stuff has application just to experience for Kant. I will say more on that in a moment. I want to talk for a little bit about sources and problems that we see in metaphysics that help explain why metaphysical debate seems to go on unendingly, right? Kant, in earlier parts of the Prolegomena, he talks about how, God, there are these debates in metaphysics that just seem to go on with no resolution. The question can be asked, why is that? And I think Kant wants to address that some here in this part of the Prolegomena that I had you look at for today. I have in my notes here that according to Kant, the innate concepts of the understanding, like that of cause, they exist to let us form empirically testable judgments of experience. Such judgments of experiences are formed by applying innate concepts to our judgments of perception, our perceptual data. As such, the innate concepts of the understanding, such as that of cause, I think he also lists substance as one of these, they only have legitimate application to perceptual data. Kant says that what leads to the endless debates in metaphysics is when these concepts of the understanding are applied to discussions about things in themselves, noumenal objects, which lie outside of any possible perception. When we do this, when we apply a priori concepts of the understanding, such as that of cause, to things that lie outside of any possible experience, when we do this, we are soon making claims that we cannot empirically test, that we cannot empirically verify. And once this happens, we have entered into discussions that give rise to disagreements that cannot be resolved. Since we have no access to things in themselves as they stand outside of any possible experience, right? Rather, we only have access to perception. The notions of cause and substance, they only have application to things within our perceptual awareness, and we use these to form judgments of experience. And so if we apply concepts of cause or substance, concepts of the understanding to things that stand outside of any possible experience, then soon we're making claims about things that there's no way to empirically test or verify. And this easily gives rise to debates in metaphysics that are unsolvable, because there's no way to sort of verify the claims being made. Having said all that, as we'll see next time, Kant thinks that this phenomenal noumenal distinction will actually enable us, right? If we do metaphysics in the right sort of way, and if we pay attention to the phenomenal noumenal distinction, Kant does think that certain historically enduring metaphysical disputes can be resolved, as we'll see in his discussion of the antinomies of pure reason. But let me say a little bit about Kant on science and what it's really about. I've already hinted at this earlier. I think an important upshot of Kant's discussion in the reading for today is that science is about the world as we perceive it. And it's about how we must perceive the world. Science, for Kant, it's not about the world of things in themselves outside of the mind. Right? Science is not about the world of things in themselves which exist external to our minds as the ground of our perceptual awareness. right? Science is about the world internal to our mind as perceived and as experienced. So for instance, right, when I say water boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit at 1 atmospheric pressure, I'm making a causal assertion, not about water as it is in itself, external to my mind. Rather, I'm making about a claim about water as we experience it. Right? I'm making a claim about water as we experience it. I'm making a claim about phenomenal water when I say water boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit. And the point is that anyone who subjects water as we experience it to this temperature, or anyone who sees water heated to that temperature, will also experience it boiling. Such a claim about water as experienced, phenomenal water, it is empirically testable, and thus it is scientific. That's a scientific assertion when I say water boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit, and it's scientific because it applies to water as we experience it. And when I say it boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit, the suggestion is that there's a necessary connection between my experience of water subjected to that temperature and my experience of it boiling. And when I say that water boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit, I'm saying there's a necessary connection between that experience and the other experiences, such that anyone else who experiences water at 212 degrees will then experience it boiling. And that claim is something that we can test. If you've got doubts about my assertion, go have the experience of water heated to 212 degrees Fahrenheit. I strongly suspect you will see it boil, right? When I say that releasing the pin causes it to fall, what I'm saying is that anybody on planet Earth who releases a pin into the air will experience it falling. You've got doubts, right? You've got doubts about it. Run the test for yourselves and make a video of it and send it to me. I can have all my students sending me videos of this going on. Might be kind of funny. But look, right? So, so our claims about phenomenal water, they are empirically testable and thus scientific, whereas claims about things in themselves outside of any possible experiences, these will not be empirically testable because we can have no experience of the things in themselves. We can only know that they exist as the ground of any experience. And so claims about things in themselves is not scientific because they're not empirically observable. And so we can't test them empirically. So science has to be about, because science is marked by empirically testable hypotheses, science has to be, for Kant, about the world as we experience it. It cannot be about things outside of the mind. Experience is internal to our mind. Science can't be about things external to our minds because science is something that's supposed to be empirically testable. Right? And all of this would suggest that for Kant, the causal laws discovered by scientists, they describe rules for how our mental construction of the world and perception must proceed. Scientific laws, they don't have application to, nor do they describe the world as it is in itself. For that is a world we cannot know, and science is verifiable. And as such, it must only deal with the world as we perceive it. So there you have it. That's all I've got for you on this. Have I paid attention to everything that was in the reading for today? No. I mean, that would take too much time, and we've only, the semester grows shorter by the moment. I think this is our last week of class. But I hope this has been helpful. I hope you find this interesting. I've always found it interesting. I know that Kant can be a bear to read. To this day, I'm puzzled by some passages in Kant myself. But hopefully this has been helpful. You guys stay safe out there. Bye-bye.